Okay, let's try starting again. Has everybody got copies of the slides that wants a copy of slides? I hope so, because I printed more than we need, but I think we're running low, so maybe people have got more copies. But if you need a copy of the slides, let me know, and I'll try to sort something out. Welcome back to Branding and Marketing Communications. I'm Robert Cluley. I'm the module leader for the course. You've got my contact details on the slide. As I always say, please feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions or comments on the course. This week, I've had a chance to speak to a few students about their assignment, predictably, and it's really good that you're starting to think in earnest about your assignment. I wanted to just emphasise a couple of things about the assignment. I'm more than happy to meet and talk to you about your assignment, but what I'd really ask is before you come to meet me, please do make sure you've had a look at the marking rubric that's on Moodle, because it explains quite a lot. Please make sure you've had a look at the writing guide on Moodle and all the information that's available, because a lot of the time people ask questions which have already been answered. If you just go and look at the marking rubric in particular, we've tried to be very clear about what we're looking for in your assignment. So a lot of the time when I have meetings with students, I end up just saying, well, as it says in the marking rubric, here's the answer. And that's not really a great use of my time, and I don't think it's really a great use of your time either. So if you've had a look at all those documents and you've still got questions, of course come and see me, because it's really useful for me to know what issues people are having, and then if I hear similar issues, I can deal with them collectively, which is great. But please do make sure you've had a look at the information that we've made available beforehand. So a couple of things I wanted to point out about the assignment from the meetings that I've had this week. One, somebody asked me a very technical question. It was a good question about citations, and the issue was if you talk about an author or a text, so let's just say a 2017 paper, every time that you then talk about this paper, do you need to have the brackets with the citation details? There's two schools of thought on this. One is yes, one is no. Both are fine. But the important thing is that whichever way you do it consistently. And the key criteria is it clear to the reader what you're talking about? So if you say, Robert Cluley, 2017, says blah, 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 blah. He goes on to talk about blah, 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 and he says blah, 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 blah. Maybe you don't need to put 2017 after every single reference to my name or an author's name. But if you're using lots of different texts by the same author or talking about different texts, then it gets confusing. So the safest bet is always to attach the year, and if you've got multiple papers from a year, you know, like 2017 A or B, so it's really clear to the reader what you're talking about. If you're pushed for words, and you're really looking to save words, you can perhaps do away with them. Both are fine, you need to do it consistently, but if at any point when I and Tassos are marking your work, we're not sure what you're talking about, you will lose marks in terms of communication skills. If you're doing that to try to save words, my suggestion would be you can edit your work better, and you'll be able to find redundant, unnecessary words, repetition, and confusing long sentences, which you can easily edit to make them cleaner, to reduce the word count. So I hope that's clear. You'll find with lots of matters of style, there's two different approaches, or more than two different approaches, but the key is always, is it clear to the reader what you're trying to say? Is it clear to the reader what you're talking about? And as long as it is, it should be fine. So that was quite a technical question. That was a good one because I hadn't thought of that previously. So that was a good one. A number of other students have been to see me with a particular focus on the sample front page of an essay that I showed a couple of weeks ago. I really want to emphasize why I showed that, because a number of students have been to see me and said, I have not yet been able to narrow down my topic as specifically as that sample was narrowed down. That's a problem, isn't it? No, it's not a problem. The reason I showed that was twofold. One, to show you how to format the text, like what font to put it in and so on and so forth, right? And the other was to show you that it is possible to narrow things down. Not that you have to narrow things down, but that it is possible. And how is it possible to do it? Not from starting off with a narrow bit of the literature, because how do you get to that narrow bit of the literature? You first have to have read more, and then you narrow down. That's why we call it narrowing down. Right? Start with a lot, and then it gets narrower. The essay that I showed you, which you've only seen the title and a few paragraphs of, it was very clear that the author of that essay had read widely, understood a research area, and had then picked a specific element of that research area to focus on. That's great. But you can't just focus on the specific area. That's not great. Because that doesn't show that you've got a wider appreciation of the literature. Okay? So a number of people have been seeing me and said, well, I've tried looking at the reading lists and I can't find a narrow topic to focus on. That's thinking about it the wrong way. You get to your narrow topic by reading widely. Some literature, some areas of the literature, some topics don't have clearly defined narrow components. So you either need to make them up in your understanding of the literature, or you can't pick a narrow topic because it's not in the literature. And that's fine. Okay? So I had a good meeting with one student the other day and I was saying, the topics are, there's no easy topic, they're just difficult in different ways. So some topics are very difficult to understand, like I think semiotics is a topic where when you read them, the papers, they're quite difficult to understand. They use a lot of strange terms and words. But once you do understand them, they're saying a very similar thing. And once you've understood those words, it's easier to do. But understanding them is difficult. Some topics, like attitude theory or processing theory, have lots and lots and lots written about them. So the difficulty there is trying to get a good picture of all the literature, because there's so much. But they're a bit more straightforward to understand. And then there are some areas where there's not as much literature, and it seems perhaps more easy to understand what people are saying, but it's difficult to put things together. Like the outdoor advertising topic is one where there's a range of different people doing very different things in outdoor advertising. It's kind of hard to see how they relate to each other. The task there is to find some way to interpret them, to summarize the literature, to try to find connections. So there's three different challenges in the literature review. One, understanding what people are saying. Two, understanding the literature as a whole. And three, finding connections between them. My suggestion would be changing topics, as a couple of students have been seeing me and said, should I change topic? And my answer would be no, because the topics aren't easier or harder, they're just easier and harder in different ways. So you're not going to find a topic which is super easy. We haven't got one. If there was one there, I would tell you all to do it. Some of the topics are harder, like semiotics is hard to understand, and you get credit for doing that, right? If you look at the marking rubric, you get credit for comprehension, how well you understand it. So the point I'm trying to make is don't start thinking, because he showed us a essay which had a very narrow focus, we have to have a narrow focus. No, you don't. It depends on the literature, and it depends on your understanding of the literature. Some literatures don't have narrow focuses, some do. Okay, so if you're thinking, I haven't got a specific topic within my literature, read more, try to understand the topics, see if you can select one. If you can't find one, that's fine. You can get just as good marks for doing a broad literature review as a narrow literature review, if that reflects the state of the literature. Okay? Before we go on, has anybody got any questions about the assignment? No? Oh, fantastic. That's good. Okay. Well, if you have, I know I'm meeting a couple of students later today and throughout the week. Please feel free to come and see me. One thing I'm not going to do, and just to clarify, is it's not possible for me to look at everyone's individual plans, and I'm not going to do that because it's not helpful for you or me, because really in a literature review, the structure of your argument is meaningless. So just coming in with like a list of headings, I will just say, I'll say the same answer to all of you, which is, yeah, that looks fine. So I'd rather you don't come and say, can you look at my plan? Because I'll just say, yeah, that looks fine. Because it could be. Right? It depends on your reading of the literature and the literature you're looking at. What's more important than the headings is what's underneath the headings. And I can't read that because that would mean marking all of your work. And I do that after you've handed it in, I'm afraid. So if you do want to come see me and you've got an issue or you can't understand something or you're struggling with a paper or a term, those things are great. If you want to show me a plan, fine, but I will just say, as I have to a couple of already, yeah, that's fine. So I don't think it would be very helpful, my main point. Okay. Let's move on. Is everyone okay to move on? Yeah. Okay, good. So we had last week off to do your second Moodle lesson, looking more at some different qualitative approaches to branding and marketing communications research. So I thought I'd just take this as an opportunity, because we're in class 8 now, just to reiterate what we're trying to do on the module and where we're at. So we're trying to achieve 3 things on this module, and we're sort of doing them back to front. So we've been looking at different theoretical models developed in branding and marketing communications research over the last few weeks. We've looked at psychological theory, we've looked at rhetoric and communications theory, we've looked at sociological theory, we've looked at cultural theory. 2 weeks ago, we looked at media theory. Those are the main theoretical traditions that have contributed to branding and marketing communications research. One thing you might want to do when you're reading your literatures is think, are these psychological studies, sociological studies, cultural studies, or media studies? That might be one way to develop a deeper interpretation of the literature. And hopefully you can position work within the discussions we've had in class. So I sort of feel like we've covered the material for this, what's currently the second aim of the course. We're also trying to highlight important and pertinent ethical, social, and political issues involved with branding and marketing communications, research, theory, and practice. And we've been trying to do that pretty much every week when we've been looking at theory and research. Over the next few weeks, we're going to start trying to think about practices and some of the issues involved in practice. And the aim that we've not really touched on too much, but we're going to move on to, is to think about the nature and scope of the marketing communications industry, thinking more about how branding and marketing communications gets actually produced in the real world. Not just how it's researched and understood, but how it's actually produced. So that's what we're going to move on to do. So over the next couple of weeks, we've got some more descriptive, more practical classes, less theoretical, and thinking more about what actually happens and how things work. So hopefully, you feel confident that you can see how we're trying to meet these 3 aims, and you're confident as to where we are at on the course. My hope is at this point, all of you understand at least the basics of what psychological theories of branding and marketing communication are and what they're trying to do. The same for sociological theory, the same for cultural theory, the same for media theory. And hopefully at this point, you should also have a decent appreciation of research methods, quantitative and qualitative. So what I want to do today is think about how and why practitioners produce particularly advertising and branding campaigns in the ways that they do. And what I want to suggest to you is that there are 2 broad schools of thought which are very prominent in marketing communications practice. One is called scientific advertising, and the other is called creative advertising. So I want to talk about where those approaches came from, what they mean, and what they look like today. So by the end of the class, hopefully you should be able to think about examples of branding in marketing communications and think, is this an example of a scientific approach or a creative approach? And science and creative have very particular meanings when we're talking about marketing communications practice. Very particular. It is not necessarily what you think it's going to mean. So I want to talk about those today. But before we get there, last lesson, 2 weeks ago, we didn't get around to finishing, we didn't even get around to starting the critical discussion of new social media theory and techniques. So I just want to quickly, hopefully, whip through some of that content so we're all confident that we've covered everything we needed to cover. So if you cast your mind back a couple of weeks, you'll hopefully remember that we looked at different ways of theorizing media. And we started off thinking about different forms of mediation or different relationships which are created by different types of media. So we compared and contrasted one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, and many-to-many media. I had quite an extended discussion, and I thank you all for your contributions to that. Then we moved on to think more specifically about new media, often digital media, and how they differ from more traditional one-to-many broadcast media, which have been popular amongst marketing communicators. So we considered the interactive advertising model, which emphasizes the new outcomes, the new consumer responses that branding and marketing communications can produce. We thought about models which have attempted to sort of give more detail to these relationships when it comes to things like social networks and mobile advertising. And we argued that most of those models emphasize that the benefits of new media, social media, is the ability to personalize messages, to make them more relevant, and to allow consumers to share messages between themselves because they're more trusted. Okay? And we try to think about why that might be the case. Why might it be useful for media channels to allow consumers to share messages or personalize messages to make them relevant to consumers' needs and interests? And one of the explanations we covered was the persuasion knowledge model. The persuasion knowledge model says essentially consumers are inherently skeptical or suspicious of any attempt to persuade them of something. If you feel like you're being sold something, not for your benefit, but for the benefit of the person selling it, you'll often be a little bit hesitant or skeptical. So when consumers start to perceive a technology, a media channel, or even a technique as being an attempt to persuade them of something, they'll be more skeptical of it. And what this means is the ability or the effectiveness of the media or technique will decrease. So what does that mean? Well, it means if you tell me something and I think you're just my friend giving me a recommendation about a great new product, I'll trust it because I don't think you're trying to sell me the product. There's no benefit to you. You're just doing it because you think you want to help me, so I'll trust you. If a brand tells me the same thing, well, I'll be thinking in the back of my head, that brand's trying to sell me a product, not because it's good for me, because it's good for them if I buy it. So it'll be less effective. So the persuasion knowledge model starts to help us understand the appeal of some new and social media, at getting around those inbuilt biases, that skepticism that consumers have of persuasive messages. And we considered advertising avoidance, 3 different forms of advertising avoidance, as ways that consumers can resist or stop attempts to persuade them. So you simply turn the TV off. You skip the video on social media. You install an ad blocker on your phone so that you don't have to be exposed to messages. Why? Because once you understand or recognise that something is an attempt at persuasion, it's less effective. Because you can do things about it. You can avoid it. And we briefly, 2 weeks ago, considered how marketing communicators respond to some of those challenges. And we looked at the POEM approach, which suggests that advertisers can use paid media, owned media, and earned media to get round avoidance. And what most of those techniques encourage marketing communicators to do is to make their branding and advertising messages not look like branding and advertising. To make it look like news, and we talked about native advertising a couple of weeks ago, or to make it look like entertainment content. And we talked about product placements briefly a couple of weeks ago as well. So that's what we covered, that's where we're at, just as a recap. But all these approaches have some very important critical issues, which is always worth highlighting. And one of the issues the marketing communicators have been experiencing in recent years is a realization that some of the hopes around new media channels, some of the hype around new media channels, hasn't actually played out in the way they thought it would. And it's because they were not necessarily attentive to some of these critical issues. So I want to talk about issues of privacy, control, and transparency. And I'll just go through these relatively quickly as a series of examples of some of the issues. So firstly, when it comes to something like POEM, making marketing communications not look like marketing communications, there's a whole series of criticisms of this. Firstly, from journalists, artists, and cultural producers who feel that this is in some way exploitative of their work. And there's been a number of very high-profile cases of people like bloggers who it turned out were being sponsored by brands, ending up saying, I'm not happy doing this anymore. I'm not happy changing what I want to say to fit in with the brand that's paying me. This is an ethical question there. An ethical question in terms of the producers of marketing communications. Is it ethical to make marketing communications that doesn't look like it's marketing communications? So it's long been held in almost every regulatory system that branding and marketing communications has to be clearly identified as branding and marketing communications. Why? Because there are some people, either who have a cognitive impairment or who are just not developed like children, who can't necessarily distinguish between persuasive messages and unpersuasive messages. And they're then very highly susceptible to being persuaded of things which might be against their interests. So it's always been held that it ethically is a necessity for branding and marketing communications to look like branding and marketing communications and not look like newspaper articles, not look like entertainment media. So that's why many countries you have TV shows and then you have advertising breaks in the middle of them. Because that's where the persuasive messages take place. And when you read a newspaper, you have the article and then you have the advert next to it. Because it's long been held that consumers expect advertisers to be honest about what they're trying to do. So there's an ethical question about blurring this distinction between the church and state, as we called it a couple of weeks ago. Blurring the distinctions between persuasive messages and other types of messages. How you personally feel about that is obviously a matter of your personal choice, but there is an ethical question about it. One of the other, personally, I think the biggest problem with new media in particular is it's often being promoted in terms of the measurability of responses. So we talked last lecture about how traditionally it was very difficult to measure consumer responses to media. You didn't know whether somebody had watched your advert on television. One of the benefits that has been purported about new media is it does allow you much more accurately to measure what consumers are doing around your marketing communications. So you can measure how many times somebody clicks on your online advert. And that is a good indication that they've seen it, They've comprehended it, and then they've finally done something. Okay? Now, there's always been issues around how much people actually click on an advert and then go on and buy something, and the systems which try to model that. There's always been questions around, does everyone always mean to click on adverts? And I'm sure you've all had experiences on your phone when you've been pressing something and you've clicked on an advert without meaning to. One of the biggest problems, though, with this approach, which went unrecognised for about a decade and has cost brands billions of dollars a year, is it turns out almost all of those responses can be fabricated or manipulated. Right, with one small line of code, which I could write for you in 5 seconds, you can easily make up clicks. So you can tell this computer to go on an advert and just keep clicking on it. So you get millions and millions of clicks. Well, why is that a problem? It's a problem in 2 reasons. One, if you're measuring the success of your marketing communications in terms of clicks, and lots of them are by computers, not people, you're measuring the wrong thing. The other issue is it turns out that a lot of online advertising systems actually charge people every time there's a click. So what some particularly unscrupulous branding and marketing communications providers have done is they charge advertisers and brands every time a consumer clicks on an advert, and then they write a computer program that goes and clicks on the advert tens, hundreds, thousands of times. So people are paying for clicks that never happen. Now you might think that's not a massive issue. Well, it turns out it is a massive issue. It's called ad fraud because it is technically fraudulent. It's making up sales which don't exist. And it's been estimated that this costs brands anywhere between $6 and $60 billion every single year. Just think about that. Between $6 and $60 billion is paid for advertising which is displayed to no one other than a computer. If you're measuring the success and paying for your marketing communications in terms of particular responses, and it turns out those responses are fraudulent, have you got good data? No. Are you making good decisions? No, you're not. So it turns out one of the big critical issues for new media in particular is that the responses, which are supposed to make marketing communications more accountable and more transparent, actually it's data, but it's not information. It doesn't tell practitioners anything useful, and it costs them billions a year. So in recent years, there's been an attempt to develop better consumer response measures. The most popular one, which I wrote about in quite a good paper actually, is called viewability. And a viewable ad is now the basis of all online digital marketing. And a viewable ad is defined as an advert which is on a screen for 2 seconds or more. So if an advert is on a screen for 2 seconds or more, it's classed as having been viewed by a consumer, and a brand has to pay for it. Okay? 2 seconds. Now my question to you, going back to psychological theory that we looked at, what were the 5 steps of information processing? Exposure, attention, comprehension, yielding or acceptance, and then retention. For digital marketing communications, you have to do all 5 of those things in 2 seconds. Facebook has their own definition of a viewable ad, and for Facebook, it is anything above 0.0000 seconds. In other words, as soon as an advert has been displayed on your, if you have Facebook, I don't, if you have Facebook, on your timeline, even if you're just scrolling through it like that, it's classed that you have viewed it, that you have paid attention to it, you have comprehended it, you've accepted it, and you've retained it. And the brand has to pay for it. This is the official standard metric of online marketing communications. Theoretically, it's very difficult to justify, but practically, it is the case. So, first critical issue, there's a kind of ethical issue with some of the new media techniques which blur the boundaries between branding and marketing communications and other forms of content. Next issue is one of transparency. Many of the responses that new media produce are actually very, very questionable when you look into what they actually are. And they've cost brands and practitioners, very clever people with very big computers and big offices, billions of dollars a year, literally displaying advertising to nobody. Another issue, we talked about the idea of a feedback loop when we looked at communications theory. And one of the things which we've seen in practice is many new media which target consumers with advertising, particular advertising messages, have ended up having some quite strange effects on consumers. So one of the strange effects is we've seen consumers actually modify their behavior to manipulate the types of adverts that they see on social media. So in some cases, they felt that the advertising messages position them in a lower status, lower class group, which doesn't make them feel good about themselves. So they change their online behavior in an effort to try to get better adverts to make themselves feel better about themselves. So what's happening is you get this very strange feedback loop where brands are trying to show somebody something because they think it's relevant, but the consumers are actually manipulating the system, not because they're interested in the advertising messages, but for other personal and social reasons. Another issue with presenting consumers with personalized marketing communications is there's an issue as to when people can stop that and how much people know they can stop things. This woman, I show you, she was, unfortunately, her data got given over onto a particular mailing list because she made a donation to charity. And what that did was it flagged her up in a database as being somebody that's likely to make donations to charity. What happened then was lots and lots of charities started to write letters to her trying to get money from her. She received hundreds and hundreds of letters. And of course what charities do in letters is they say, it's awful, there's lots of children dying in the world, please give us some money. It's awful, there's lots of people dying from cancer or some horrible disease, please give us money. This lady, which she lived about in the UK years ago, actually committed suicide as a result of this. She was bombarded with all these letters, which were supposed to be targeting her with something relevant and personalised to her interests, but actually it created this horrible world, this awful psychological environment for her, where she just felt like she couldn't escape all of these letters every day arriving at her door. Now, of course, it turned out she could have done. There's ways that you can get your name off of those databases, but a lot of people don't know about. So there's real dark sides of targeting, where people don't necessarily have control over it. And it can be the case that that has damaging effects for individuals and for brands. Another example. Not too long ago, a number of studies were published which were using Facebook data, where researchers have done experiments on Facebook users to try to manipulate them. And these will be seen to be highly controversial, particularly in academic communities, because the Facebook users hadn't explicitly granted consent to be part of the experiments. So what were the experiments doing? Well, they were doing things like targeting particular groups with really negative stories, really negative messages, and seeing if that changed how they interacted with the platform. Targeting other consumers with really positive, nice stories and seeing if that changed how they interacted with the platform. Of course, you can probably predict the results. It did, but the ethical question is that right? Is it right for brands like Facebook to target particular consumers to intentionally try to make them unhappy without their permission? As an academic researcher, like the University of Nottingham would not let me do that. I'm supposed to be trying to make you happy, right? But Facebook was able to do it, and it opened up a big can of worms. They made recommendations on the basis of some of these studies, which are kind of problematic. So one of the things that they found was that women in particular are more susceptible to essentially kind of cosmetics and beauty advertising campaigns if they're feeling conscious about their bodies, if they're feeling vulnerable about their self-image. So Facebook has the ability to make particular groups of women feel vulnerable about their bodies and self-images. How? By showing them pictures of beautiful people, not them. And that makes them the women more susceptible to branding and marketing communications messages for beauty products. Now, is that ethical? Is it right that a brand could do that a brand could intentionally make consumers emotionally vulnerable in order to target them with marketing communications? Maybe you don't have a problem with it. I think I do, but it's an issue. So this is one of the conclusions of the study that they did. They said, companies should concentrate media during prime vulnerability moments, aligning content involving tips and tricks, instant beauty rescues, dressing for success, getting organised for the week, and empowering stories. On vulnerable moments. That's the key bit. On vulnerable moments. And it's problematic because when you add it to these studies, which prove Facebook and other social media platforms can produce vulnerable moments in terms of the content that they show you, then you start to get this kind of problematic situation for users of those services where they don't know whether the information and the entertainment and the connections that they're seeing on social media are for their benefit or for advertisers' benefit. One of the things that I always like to point out at this point when it comes to social media, I don't know which platforms you use, but let's just take Facebook because we're talking about them. How much does Facebook cost its users? Like if you've got a Facebook account, how much does it cost you? Okay, well, how's about a search engine search? If you type in something to Google or another search engine, how much does it cost you to do a search? Nothing, right? It's free. On most of these platforms, the users of the platforms are not the consumers of the platforms. The consumers of the platforms are brands and marketing communicators. That's who they're set up to benefit, not the users of the platforms. It's been estimated that the value of one user to Facebook in the UK is £1,500. That's how much advertising they sell to each of their users in the UK, £1,500 a year. So, if you know that those social networks and social media companies can manipulate their users to make them feel vulnerable, and that those vulnerable moments benefit the people that actually pay for social media companies, you might think there's an incentive on social media companies to do this. And the persuasion knowledge model would say if consumers knew about it, they might find that these messages are less effective. The problem is consumers often don't know about these things because there's a lack of transparency about them. Why is there a lack of transparency about them? Well, because the systems that regulate them and that are in place are very confusing to understand. So, like, how many times have you said, I accept the terms of some software? Probably hundreds of times in your life. How many times have you read the terms of software? Never, right? No one ever does it. So you don't know what you're signing up for. This was one a few years ago. It turned out if you installed iTunes, you also agreed that you would not use iTunes to produce a nuclear weapon as part of their terms and conditions. It's kind of funny because who would use iTunes to make a nuclear bomb? But that's what each user of iTunes, and I signed up to that, we all agreed to that because people didn't read it. Even the users of many of these new media services don't understand how they work. So a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, there was a case of Amazon products being sold which said quite offensive messages on them. So you could buy T-shirts which said all these like horrible kind of aggressive statements on. And when people complained, the company that made these t-shirts said, we don't actually put the phrases on, we've just got a computer that scours the internet, finds phrases, and makes pictures of them to put on Amazon, and we don't even print them until somebody's bought one. They didn't understand how it was working to produce these really offensive images. Another example, a famous example from computer science, there's a book called The Making of a Fly, which was one of the most expensive products you could buy on Amazon. The cheapest copy of this book was $18 million. If you didn't want the cheap one and you wanted the slightly more expensive one, you would have to pay $23 million for it. Why was this book so expensive? It was so expensive because neither of these two sellers actually owned a copy of the book. And what they were doing, and what a lot of online marketplaces do, is they were pegging themselves against each other. So there's 4D Books was assuming that if somebody bought their book for $23 million, they would buy this copy for $18 million and send it to them. The problem was they were both pegged to each other. So they just kept multiplying each other's sale price. So there was an algorithm which you can easily use, or a computer program you can easily use to do this, and you would just say, like, add a percentage onto the cheapest version of a book and list it. On the assumption then if you buy it, if somebody buys it, you buy the cheaper copy, sell it to them and keep the profit. And if you sell your copy to somebody and you can't buy one, you just cancel the sale and who cares? Which is a great system, it's very smart, but the problem in this case was because the two sellers were multiplying each other's price, every day the price went up from a cover price of like $20 to $18 million. Even the people that were using these systems didn't understand how they worked. So how can consumers, how can users of them know? Very difficult. And what we've seen is there's been a number of high-profile cases where brands and marketing communicators have failed to address these issues, like the recent Cambridge Analytica scandal in the US and the UK elections. And it's really, really cost them, both in terms of brand value, reputational damage, but also in terms of their financial bottom line. So after, I don't know if you know the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I don't need to go into it in detail, but one of the responses of consumers after this scandal where people found out about some data manipulation that Facebook was doing was more people unsubscribed or signed off of their Facebook account than had ever happened before. And bear in mind, each one of those users is £1,500. Each one that unsubscribes from Facebook costs them a lot of money. What we've also seen is a number of activists end up hacking particular brands and breaching their data as a way of attacking them back. So this was one that happened a couple of years ago. It was a dating website, and it got hacked because people didn't think it was particularly ethical. And then there was an Excel spreadsheet that you could download to look to see who was trying to cheat on their husband and wife because of this problematic system. So these issues have costs. They have costs for brands. They have costs for marketing communicators, both in terms of something like ad fraud, which costs literally billions each year, but also in terms of just reputational risk when it blows up and goes wrong. So although new media has a lot of benefits, it's always worth paying attention to and critiquing the issues with it, because when they aren't addressed, that's when brands get into trouble. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to talk about when it comes to media theory. So we looked at media theory 2 weeks ago, we looked at models of the effectiveness of new and social media, and we've now just looked through some critical discussions of new and social media, thinking about privacy, transparency, and control. Has anybody got any questions? No? Good, great. So before we move on to think about scientific and creative advertising, I'd like you to do a little task. It's called the concept and execution task. A concept is a key part of branding and marketing communications practice, as is an execution. These are technical terms. An execution is just an advert. So whenever you see an advert in the marketing communications industry, it will often have been referred to as an execution. And an execution, an advert, is a particular manifestation of a concept. So a marketing campaign, a branding campaign will have a concept, which is a way that they want to deliver a key message to their audience. And that concept can appear in several different executions. Does that make sense? Does that not make sense? I don't know what to make of that because you're just mumbling. Do you want me to explain it again? Give you an example? Okay. I'll give you an example. Let's say you want to advertise. I've got an example there which I'm trying not to think about now. Let's say you want to advertise an iPhone. Right, you want to promote iPhone. What do you want to say about the iPhone? You might want to say that it's sleek and stylish and is going to help you enjoy your life. That is a concept. How do you say that to consumers? Well, you might make a video that shows people doing lots of fun things. That's an execution. You might make a video which literally says, iPhone is sleek and stylish. That's an execution. You might have a print campaign. You might have a humorous advertising campaign. All of those are executions of the same concept. So in marketing terms, a concept is almost like a strategy. And then the execution, the reason it's called an execution is because it's a particular execution of that strategy. It's an example of it. Okay? So what I would like you to do, we have a case study. Does everybody know Reese's Pieces, Reese's peanut butter chocolate candy? It looks like this. You can buy it in the shop downstairs. So, you've got some information about Reese's brand and organisation. And what you're asked to do is come up with a concept for an advertising campaign in groups. So you're all on tables, it works kind of nicely. So you've got 20 minutes to read this information. And come up with a concept for Reese's. So go for it. You are allowed to talk as well if you want to. So. Okay, could I get somebody from one of the groups to volunteer to tell me your concept to promote Reese's Pieces? Yeah. Just 1 second. Everyone, excuse me, can people stop talking because one of your classmates is very kindly volunteered.
It's our concept link the family activities, familyship, because it's long history, it's historical, it's classical. It means familyship never change. It's peanut butter and chocolate.
I like it. So kind of idea of friendship between peanut butter and chocolate. And playing on the history of the brand.
Yeah.
There's been this long-standing.
Classical.
Okay, great. That's really good. Thank you. So, have you thought about how you might execute that concept? What might an advert look like?
TV advertising.
Okay. And what would it say?
Like I don't know. Two friends. They are friends from childhood.
Yeah.
And when they grow up, they are equal to work. They're still friends, and they still have the business.
I like it. That's actually really good. You've got a future. Great. That's a really good idea, right? So, is there a particular, have you designed that with a particular type of consumer in mind? So, would it be a British consumer, an American consumer, a Brazilian consumer? Like, who do you think that would appeal to, the notion of friendship? It's okay if you've not thought that through. Okay, well, I guess one thing to think about is, like, earlier on in the course we talked about cultural values. We talked about how different groups of consumers, different societies value particular lifestyles, right? So the idea of friendship and some things being classical, those particular values, they're cultural values that you'd be playing off on in your campaign. And does anybody else want to volunteer their concept? Yeah.
We had the idea of targeting the UK market with the concept of surprising situations.
Okay.
To do with the kind of surprisingly good combination of chocolate and peanut butter.
Okay. So the idea of surprise, so like something that's surprisingly good that you wouldn't expect, it goes together but really does. So how would you execute that concept?
You have like one execution would be like a still image of a shocked face emoji with message like shockingly good flavor combination.
Okay. So you'd be going much more for taste, right? And flavours. Great. So we've got two concepts, both really good, particularly given you only have a few minutes to come up with them. One which draws on the brand values, the idea that it's this long-standing historical brand, and another which thinks about emphasising the taste. And you've been playing a lot around that kind of something being surprising, two things going together. You think about rhetoric that we talked about earlier on in the course. We talked about tropes, how you have something which is unexpected or shocking. You can really emphasise that with a message. You've very helpfully provided me with two examples, which I really was hoping you were going to, right? So this first one is very much focused on the brand. The second example is very much focused on the product. So we have flavour, and we have a classic, long-standing combination in a brand. Product, brand. That really neatly represents the distinction that I want to talk through for the rest of the day between scientific and creative advertising. And I can give you it in a very short space of time. Scientific advertising is focused on the idea that what consumers need is information about products to make better choices. So they need to know about the flavours. They don't really care about the brand. Feelings, emotions, values. They want to know, is this product a good product? That's at the heart of scientific advertising. Creative advertising is the opposite. It says, no, actually there's a lot of products which are very similar to each other. And what consumers really value is a brand. And a brand is created out of nothing. It doesn't have to have any relationship with the product. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. Scientific advertising is an approach to designing advertising and a style of advertising which emphasises features of the product, benefits to consumers of consuming the product. So it's two things. It's a way of producing advertising and a style of advertising. So one of the most immediate ways that scientific advertising is scientific is, in terms of the style, it often draws on factual information. And taken to its heart, that is kind of scientific information. So often you'll see in health and beauty campaigns, they'll have the science bit of the advert, where they talk about the chemicals and how it does things to your hair. This is part of scientific advertising. It uses factual knowledge, scientific information about a product. But it doesn't just have to be scientific, it could be about flavour combination. And really emphasises that, really plays up features of the product. So as a style of advertising in terms of the content, it will often look like this. So it'll be 5 times faster, and they'll tell you about clinical studies which do things, and it's going to really emphasise aspects of the product. And the thought behind it links back to some of the consumer decision-making theories we looked at in week 2, that consumers face risky decisions, and what marketing communications can do is minimise that risk by giving consumers a lot of information about what they will get from a product. How will the product make their lives better? Right? It's a great flavour combination. Or it works even better than all the competition. So that's the first sense in which it's scientific. It often uses factual knowledge. But behind that, as a way of producing marketing communications, it also has a scientific approach, and I'll talk you through that. The idea of scientific advertising actually goes back over 100 years. And it was set out by this guy, his name is Claude Hopkins. He wrote a book called Scientific Advertising at the turn of the 20th century. It is still the best-selling book on advertising. It's reportedly sold over 6 million copies. David Ogilvy, who created one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world, said nobody should be allowed to have anything to do with advertising until they've read the book 7 times. I'm not going to ask you to read it 7 times, but I'll tell you what it said. Okay? That's my deal. So, Claude Hopkins had a very interesting story, which I've probably not got a full time to go into, but essentially he was an accountant. And as an accountant, he always felt that he was at risk of getting the sack. because he knew accountants were costs. They didn't make money for businesses, they just cost money. He was an accountant, he knew that, right? So he was desperate to move into a bit of a business which made money. He thought that was how he could make his fortune. If he could create value for his organisation, he would never be at risk. As he was coming up with some of these thoughts, it was at the time when branding and marketing communications was actually kind of just starting, branding and marketing communications as we'd understand it now. So advertising in newspapers and magazines nationally. It was in America, it was about the same time. And people didn't really know how to actually do advertising at the time, they were kind of guessing. And Hopkins developed what he called scientific advertising as a way of coming up with better information about what worked. Instead of just guessing, he said, let's do tests. So one of his biggest innovations was the idea of a test market. This is still a concept, an idea which you see in marketing today. Hopkins came up with it at the turn of the 20th century. He said, if we've got a concept and an execution, instead of spending all of our money all at once and doing this huge national advertising campaign that might not work, let's do a small campaign and see if it works. If we've got two great concepts, let's do two tests and see which one works the best. Okay. So he described this as an experiment, a test market as being an experiment. This is one of the reasons why he said it was scientific advertising. Because he said, by doing enough experiments, you could figure out precisely what worked. And he believed this experimental approach, which he was the only person doing at the time, had allowed him to uncover what he called fundamental rules of marketing communications and branding. He said, it doesn't matter what you're advertising, what your product is, what your brand is, through scientific methods, through doing tests, you can find out rules that just work for everybody. Okay? So almost like facts about how to do branding and marketing communications. And it doesn't matter whether you're advertising a mobile phone or some chocolate. You just have to follow the rules. And here are some of the rules that he discovered through his test markets. He said, brilliant writing has no place in advertising. Advertising has to be plain, natural, and simple. He said, advertising should just give facts. Right? You shouldn't boast. You shouldn't show off about anything. You shouldn't talk about how your brand is the best. You should talk about the product. How does it work? What's good about it? And what will a consumer get from it? And you should do that in as plain, clear, simple a language as possible. Because the more plain, clear, and simple it is, the easier it is for a consumer to understand. I think back to psychological processing theory. We know that's the case, right? And he talked about the main purpose of branding, marketing, communications is to offer service. He said people don't look at branding and marketing communications for fun or entertainment. They look at branding and marketing communications if it's going to give them some value. And the value should be it makes their consumer decisions easier, less risky. It makes you more confident in the decisions that you make. So he said, humour, joking, any of those kind of things have no place in branding and marketing communications. He said, don't try to compete with stories or news columns or with pictures or cartoons or other forms of media. Offer consumers service. And they'll go to, that's what they go to advertising for, to find out about products and brands. So if you give them information about your products and brands, you don't need to be funny, because that's what consumers want from branding and marketing communications. Oops. And he said the purpose of all branding and marketing communications should be to get action. Marketing communications and branding needs to get people to do something. That's not necessarily buy the product, but you need to get them to do some kind of action, something. It's not just about the brand value, it's about getting consumers to actually do something. And he was a huge advocate of the use of a coupon. It's like a discount coupon in newspapers. And he said, the great thing about a discount coupon in a newspaper is somebody has to cut it out. And that action of cutting it out makes people far more likely to then go and act on the information. So behind this is an idea of salesmanship called the Eiger model, a very popular model. It says, if you want to sell something to somebody, you have to get them interested in it, get them to desire it or want it, and then get them to do something. So like if you go to buy a car, you get somebody to take it for a test drive. That's sales. Once you've got somebody to test drive a car, chances are they're going to buy it. If you get somebody to cut out a coupon, chances are they will redeem the coupon. Coupons had two benefits in Hopkins' system. One, he said, if you give somebody a discount coupon, that makes it less risky for them to buy the product because it's cheaper. Which means you're offering service. Which means you're doing good advertising. So that's the first thing, right? You make life better for consumers by giving them a coupon or a discount code. The other great thing Hopkins said about coupons is if somebody reads a newspaper, sees an advert, cuts out a coupon, goes into a shop with that coupon, buys the product, hands the coupon over, you can collect all the coupons and you can count how many people bought your product because they saw your advert, how many people read a particular newspaper or magazine. You can measure consumer responses. So if you're running a test market and you've got a coupon, you can measure the success of your advertising campaigns. You can compare different media types because you can have different coupons. You can have red coupons and green coupons, right? You can see which one works best. You could do one concept and another concept, have different coupons, see which one works best. This is the process of doing scientific advertising. Nowadays, it tends to be called either A/B testing, or sometimes it's called pre-post testing. A/B testing is a better term for it, because it's just a comparison of different ways of doing things. You get two concepts, you run tests and see which one works best, A or B. You have two executions, you see which one works best, A or B. You run your media in two different newspapers or two different websites, and you can see which one works best. Sorry, you can't. Can you guys see that? The other thing you can do then is you can start to, the technical term is, optimize your advertising campaigns. If you know that a particular magazine is really effective with your target market and you're getting lots of coupons brought in, invest more in it. If you know something's not working, take the money that you were investing in that and invest it in the thing that is working. Hopkins, as an accountant, said, if you're giving people a discount, you can actually pretty easily calculate how much discount are you paying people and how effective is your advertising at acquiring sales. So he said you can start to think of advertising as being a way of buying customers. And you can figure out how effective is it. We see this today in discussions of what's called ROMI, or Return on Marketing Investment. Or other popular measures, like there's one called the acquisition costs per customer, which is a cost in your advertising to buy a customer. And of course, a good brand buys the most customers as cheaply as possible. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by finding out through test markets which concepts work best for which consumers, which executions work best, which media works best, and then you just invest in that. So this is the scientific approach to doing marketing communications. Here's some examples. This was Hopkins' first advertising campaign. It was for like a vacuum cleaner, an early vacuum cleaner. And this is actually the company that he worked for when he was still an accountant. And he said to them, let me have a go at doing some advertising. And the company said to him, well, we don't want to waste all of our money because you've never done it before. And he said, well, look, just let me write letters to 1,000 customers. And if those 1,000 customers buy some products, we can talk again. So he did. He wrote letters to 1,000 customers, emphasizing the benefits of this new carpet sweeper or vacuum cleaner. And he said to them on the letters, if you bring the letter into one of our stores, you can try one of the new vacuum cleaners for free. And then he counted all the letters that he got back, and he went to his employer and said, look, it worked. And they moved him from being an accountant to being an advertising agent. Within a couple of years, he was hired by a proper advertising agency and became the most highly paid advertising agent for decades. He was paid a fortune. These are some other examples of his campaigns. Let's talk about this one. I think it's a really good example of everything we've been talking about. This is for Pepsodent, which is a toothpaste. Hopkins believed that the first thing an advertising agent had to do was find out about the product. How does it work? Because then you can find out what's interesting, useful information to consumers, and you can tell them about it. One of the things he discovered with toothpaste is that once you've brushed your teeth, you actually brush off a layer of film of saliva. So after you've brushed your teeth feel sort of squeaky clean. Like if you rub your tongue over your teeth now, they feel a bit dirty. But do it after you brush your teeth and they feel different. Right? Now all toothpaste does that. That's how it works. Right? That doesn't matter. The point was, he said, Pepsodent does it before anybody else did. So he came up with this campaign. It was informed by scientific knowledge, and he tells stories about how he was literally reading science journals to find out how toothpaste worked. And when he read that, he thought, that is true. That moment of getting somebody to rub their tongue across their teeth, that's action. And it's interesting. And once you know that, now your teeth feel clean after you've brushed your teeth, right? And you'll want to buy that again. So this was the science, the content. But then also what you see down here, a coupon. You cut the coupon out, and in this case, actually, you've got like a free, I think you've got a free dictionary or some free book or something. If you send this coupon back. But it didn't matter. He didn't care that he had to spend a bit of money getting something to fill in the coupon. Because he wanted to know, did this campaign work? That information, that knowledge, that fact was worth more to him than giving away a free book to consumers. Getting the action, getting something to cut out of people, and it's a bit blurred, but you can see down here there's a little mark, this was a code. We call this a key. K-E-Y, key. It's just a reference number. And what he would do is different adverts in different magazines and newspapers, he'd give different reference numbers to it. So then he could count up how many of these adverts were read, consumed, with coupons cut out from one magazine compared to another. How much did both of them cost, which was the cheapest, which was the most effective, which had the highest acquisition costs, which had the lowest return on marketing investment. Okay. Hopkins developed his ideas when in a newspaper age, before television, radio, the internet, so on and so forth. And a lot of his ideas depended on coupons and cutting them out. When it comes to something like TV, that's a bit of a problem because you can't get people to cut out their TV screen. So his ideas were adapted by this man, his name is Ross Reeves. His advertising book is still the official advertising book of Harvard Business School, for example, but it's very difficult to buy a copy of, although I have one. He adapted Hopkins' ideas. He said, what we can do is we don't just need to rely on someone like Hopkins' interpretation of data. We can create databases of lots of different campaigns, and we can find out what works. In technical terms, he was looking for what's called an empirical generalization of a rule that tends to work more often than not. This is like a little example from his book. We've got all these different campaigns, and we can compare and contrast their success rate and see which ones tend to work and which ones tend not to work. Cast your mind back to week 2. This is very much a behaviourist approach, looking at a stimuli, an advertising input, and a response, and trying to find out what happens between them. And Rosser Reeves said, One of the biggest problems that brands have is they change their concept, they change their message too often. And he said, why that's a problem is, each time you're having to start from scratch again. He said, the best thing you can do, the most effective way to advertise, is to figure out what's your unique selling proposition, sometimes miswritten as unique selling position, but a unique selling proposition. What's the thing that makes your product different in the minds of consumers? Is it that it makes your teeth feel clean? That's fine. Then don't change it. Just say that message in every advertising campaign, every execution, again and 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 again. So there's two tasks. One is getting people to hear your message and to understand it. The other is to design a good message. Once you've got a good USP that actually means something for your consumers, don't change it. Just keep hammering home the same message. So this is an example of one of Ross Reeves' famous campaigns. For M&Ms. He said, M&Ms with a milk chocolate that melts in your mouth, not in your hand. Nothing about the taste or the flavour of the product. Nothing about the brand. Right? It's all about the fact that it doesn't melt in your hand. Now, I would have sat around and said, that's not going to motivate people to buy a product that it doesn't melt in your hand because you just keep it in the bag. Ross Reeves' point was, it doesn't matter what you think, it's what consumers think. And the way you find that out is by going and looking to see what worked. Run test markets. And if this message, this USP means you sell more products and consumers remember it, it's a good message. It doesn't matter what you as a brand think. So he became famous for coming up with USPs which the brands themselves maybe weren't that happy about because they weren't the most sort of sexy, glamorous market position to occupy, but were really effective. One of the things Ross Reeves found out was that there is such a thing as bad advertising. What he said is, just as a good USP can attract consumers to your brand, a bad USP can convince consumers never to buy your brand. And he said, then you've got a problem, because if you've got a bad USP and you advertise it a lot, you're convincing more and more people not to buy your product. So he said the key point is finding out what that USP is. And that, he said, is where you need a skilled advertising agent. Anybody can figure out your return on marketing investment. Anybody can count coupons. But where you need a skilled advertising agent is to come up with your USP. So brands can't do it themselves. So M&M would never have come up with this USP because they'd have said, that's boring. Who wants a chocolate that doesn't melt in your hand? Now, who would sell a brand that said, we've got a chocolate that melts in your hand? It wouldn't be the case, right? You'd never think of it. You need an advertising agent for it. Scientific advertising says there are fundamental laws of marketing. And those fundamental laws can be proved through experimentation. It doesn't matter what you're advertising. Once you know the rules, you just have to execute the rules. Right? Every brand needs to have a USP. And you can prove that that works by focusing on measurable results, primarily on sales. Ross Reeves in particular said, branding and marketing communication that doesn't concentrate on sales as its outcome is stupid. That's all you're trying to do. If you build your brand equity as a result of it, that's great, but it's all about sales. So he said, it doesn't matter if this doesn't mean consumers think M&Ms are the coolest brand in the world. If you sell more M&Ms, that's all that matters. Okay? Has anybody got any questions? No? Good. Let's keep going then. You see this idea that there is a science behind branding and marketing communications all the way up to the current day. One of the things this trend in marketing research has revealed is that there's always a new science, and the old science was never good enough. So the current glamorous science of neuromarketing, there's a belief that using neuroscience, brands and marketing communicators will be able to find out exactly how to brand and sell their products to essentially, they sometimes talk about a button in your mind that makes you buy something. There's a belief that if you just study the marketing communications scientifically, you'll find a rule, a law, that works no matter what the brand is. Now, we can have this discussion at the time. This is, if you'll excuse my French, bullshit, but a lot of people are spending a lot of money on it. It's stupid and it doesn't work. I always say that. But it's very popular. And it's just the latest manifestation of this belief that there's rules. There's a rule you can follow for your marketing communications. But there's a couple of issues with scientific advertising. It seems almost too good to be true, right? You can just buy Scientific Advertising, the book. In fact, you can download it for free now because it's not got copyright on it because it's so old. You can read the rules, and that's how to do great marketing communications. Seems simple. Paul Feldwick says, well, here's a bit of an issue with this. If it's the case that all you have to do is buy that book and read it and follow the rules, why would anybody pay Claude Hopkins a fortune to be an advertising agent? Why would he have written that book if he's going to lose his salary? And what Feldwick argues is if you actually go and look at a lot of famous scientific advertising campaigns, they're often not that scientific, and they often break a lot of their own rules. By the 1950s, the middle of the last century, there was a feeling as well that branding and marketing communicators who are following this scientific method were becoming very, very predictable. And what they were starting to encounter was advertising avoidance and the persuasion knowledge model. They were starting to find that people could see an advert because they all looked the same, because they all followed similar rules, and go, oh, that's a boring advert, I'm not interested in that. That's just trying to sell me stuff, I'm not interested in that. So I don't have time to play it, but if you want to watch the video, this is the very first TV advert in Britain. And the advertising agent who came up with it later said it was one of the most embarrassing things he'd ever done. Because he said he was just following the Claude Hopkins rules of scientific advertising, and that it didn't work. Consumers just hated it. And there was a growing feeling in the advertising industry by the 1960s that scientific advertising didn't have all the answers. And this gave birth to what was known as creative advertising. And creative advertising is in many ways just the opposite of scientific advertising. But it's also associated with a key figure. This guy, his name is Bill Bernbach. He is probably the most written about advertising agent in history. He worked at a very boring scientific advertising agency called Grey Advertising, bizarrely, which is kind of summarises how boring it was. And he got really sick of it because he just had to keep following the rules all the time. And he wrote this little manifesto which he sent to everybody in the advertising agency, and then the next day got fired. And in the manifesto he said, there's a lot of technicians in advertising who know all of the rules, but the problem is persuasion is not a science, it is an art. Persuasion isn't about facts and rules, it's about feelings, emotions, and intuitions. So he said, rather than trying to follow what scientists do with tests and experiments, maybe we need to do what artists do. So he left and created his own advertising agency where he just employed all these like cool, arty people, and he made it a really funky, cool place. Like now, if you go into advertising agencies, they have slides and lots of art on the walls and things. This all comes from Bill Bernbach. It wasn't trying to be a scientific lab. He said, let's try to make it like an artist's workshop. This was one of his campaigns. It breaks almost all of the Claude Hopkins rules. It's for Volkswagen. Hopkins said, don't have white space because it's a waste of money, and if your customers think you're wasting money, they'll think you're wasting their money and they won't buy your product. Well, look at this. There's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of space. Hopkins said, don't have adornments and fancy writing and humour and jokes. Think small. At the time, cars were always being sold as being big. So, the creative idea, let's advertise something that's small. You maybe can't appreciate it now, it's really difficult to look back, but this has been written about a whole host because of the font. This font is an incredibly modern font. In the 1960s, people hadn't seen this font. Bernbach emphasised all these artistic ideas. So they got this font by going and finding out what was the latest avant-garde graphic design ideas, and they used it in their advertising campaign. And there are reports of advertising agents when they saw this in the newspaper, literally open mouth, dropping the newspaper because they couldn't believe somebody had made an advertising campaign that broke all of the rules. But it was incredibly successful. Volkswagen is still, one of the global leading car brands to this day. At the time, it was unheard of. At the time, no one had ever heard of it. So, this is what Bill Bernbach said. Bill Bernbach didn't write down a rule book like Hopkins because he didn't believe in rules. But people have come up with some kind of ideas that he had. So he said, rules are what an artist breaks. A memorable ad never emerged from a formula. So what advertising needs to do is it needs to be distinct, entertaining, artistic, and engaging and memorable. Can't just tell you facts. Working from a method or a formula is guaranteed to do the same thing, the effectiveness of an idea, that time does for a loaf of bread. Everybody's following the same rules, they become stale and outdated and people don't want to eat them. You need to come up with something fresh and new and different all the time. And you don't do that by following rules, you do that by taking risks. Ideas must be hot out of the oven. Imitation is suicide. So he said to succeed, an ad, a product, or a brand has to establish a unique personality. Not a unique selling proposition, not following rules. It needs to have a personality, it needs to have a brand. He said, be provocative. Be extreme. Encourage consumers to have some kind of a response emotionally to your advertising campaign. And this is a couple of very famous quotes. He said, you can't sell to a man or woman who isn't listening, and a dull truth will not be looked at. An exciting lie will be looked at. He said, it's not about the fact or the information, it's about how you say what you say. About the elaboration likelihood model. It's about understanding people's attitudes to information, not the information itself. So you can say the right thing about a product, I put produce, a product, and nobody will listen. But you've got to say it in such a way that people feel it in their gut, because if they don't feel it, nothing will happen. And this is a very famous example of Bill Bernbach's thinking. He said, the truth isn't the truth until people believe you. And they can't believe you if they don't know what you're saying. And they can't know what you're saying if they don't listen to you. And they won't listen to you if you're not interesting. And you won't be interesting unless you say things imaginatively, interestingly, and freshly. So the creative advertising idea then is that you have to be different, you have to be original, you have to take risks, you have to be interesting. Why? Because it's only if you're interesting that people will listen to you, and it's only if people are listening to you that they'll ever understand what you're saying is true. So Bernbach said, rather than following the techniques of science, we follow the techniques of art. And rather than including scientific content in our campaigns, we'll include artistic content in our campaigns. This is one of the people he employed. I give you her because she's a famous advertising woman, Mary Wells Lawrence. And she was a theatre director. And she said, why don't we make products the centre of the story. Just like when you put on a play, you have to get actors and you have, the star of the show. She said, let's make a brand the star of the adverts. So she used her theatrical training. She was an artist, a theatre director. She said, let's do that for brands and advertising. This is one of her famous campaigns. It was for Alka-Seltzer, which, does everyone know what Alka-Seltzer is? It's like a stomach relief if you've got tummy ache. It makes your tummy feel better. At the time, it was medicine. It was like a very small medicine. And Mary Wells Lawrence said, why don't we change it from being a medicine to make it a lifestyle product? So she said, who has a bad stomach? She said, people that go out partying, people that are having fun, people that are succeeding in life and have got stress. They have bad tummies. They take Alka-Seltzer. So let's play on that. Let's play on those lifestyles. And so she came up with this concept for this execution, right? The concept was, let's take people to the morning after a night out when they've got bad tummy. The moment of relief is going to be when they have an Alka-Seltzer. And to make Alka-Seltzer, you take a pill and you pop it in a glass of water and then it bubbles. So she said there's a moment, you can always imagine it as being like a film, where somebody gets up, they've got a hangover, they stumble into the kitchen, they take out the Alka-Seltzer and it goes plop, plop, fizz, and then they drink it and they feel better. So that was the whole concept, right? Let's take people to that moment. Let's make drama out of this medicine. Let's make the medicine about feeling better because of your successful partying lifestyle. And she encapsulated it with this idea, plop, plop, fizz, fizz. She totally changed the nature of the product. You actually only need one Alka-Seltzer, but she said plop, fizz doesn't work as well. So she sold it, let's make it that you need 2 Alka-Seltzers. She completely changed their marketing strategy. She said, don't sell in chemists and pharmacy as medicine. Get put into supermarkets, get put into magazine stores and news agents so that people treat you as a product that they buy like chewing gum or cigarettes. She put drama into the equation. She made a story around the brand. She doesn't give factual information about how effective it is or what drugs it's got in it that make your tummy better. She could have done that. She ignored that scientific approach and said, let's make it more creative. Let's make a story about the brand. Wells Lawrence also believed in the power of celebrity. Being a theatre director, she knew that you can have a brilliant play and nobody goes to see it. You can have a rubbish play, but if it's got a star actor in, everyone's going to want to go and see it. So she said, let's do the same thing for our marketing communications. Let's make sure we always have celebrities in them, because people like celebrities, and they will listen to, watch, and engage with the brand because of the celebrity. So even if the celebrity costs a lot of money, it's worth it. The skill is picking the right celebrity. And she said what the celebrities do is they offer glamour, they offer some kind of credibility to the brand, which gets transferred across. If you think about the movement of meaning model, this was very much what she was arguing for. So Bernbach said, to keep ads fresh, you've got to keep yourself fresh. You've got to live in the current idiom, that means live in the here and now, and you'll create it. If you follow and enjoy and are excited by new tales in art, in writing, in industry, in personal relationships, whatever you do will naturally be of today. What he said was that branding and marketing communicators shouldn't follow rules. They should be out there living things. He said if you want to be a successful creative advertiser, you have to be interested in art, music, literature, film, theatre, sport. You have to be out there living it. On the edge, understanding what's the latest trend, and then you can breed that into your marketing communications. So this campaign by Mary Wells Lawrence, you've probably seen like t-shirts which have like I heart something, right? Mary Wells Lawrence came up with that in a campaign for New York. So she had these t-shirts made which said I heart NY. She didn't come up with this campaign, she stole it. She'd been to a graduate art show in a New York college where somebody had made this, and she said, "That's a great idea." One of her clients was the city of New York, so she just took it and sold it to them. Because she was going to a graduate art show, she was trying to see what's the latest trend that's happening in the art world. And this is creative advertising. Okay, so advertising is an art form. How you communicate is more important than what you communicate. Saying something freshly, even if it's a lie, will have more of an impact than a dull, boring truth. So advertisers have to break rules. They have to make adverts that don't look like adverts that stand out, that gets people's attention. And that the real benefit of adverts is to create a personality for your brand, which is ultimately an unmeasurable effect. It's a brand value. And focusing just on driving sales can undermine the brand. Just focusing on getting people to buy your product isn't adding value to the brand. So this is the tenets of creative advertising. So, to bring this all together then, we've done very quick reviews, I acknowledge, of scientific approaches and creative approaches. What we're going to see next week, when we talk about the contemporary advertising industry, is that both of these approaches are alive and kicking in branding and marketing communications. Some brands really believe in scientific approaches. Some brands really believe in creative approaches. Some advertising agencies themselves are branded in terms of their scientific approach, some in terms of their creative approach. And I would hope that you can start to think and reflect on some of the literature you're reading for your literature review, particularly the practitioner-focused stuff with implications. And you can see how sometimes they make appeals to a scientific logic, trying to find empirical generalizations or laws and rules that advertisers should follow. And sometimes they emphasize a more creative approach, one based on emotions and feelings. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be hanging around outside. This is the first lecture where we finished on time, so I've done it, yes. And I'll be around for the rest of the day until like sort of mid-afternoon. I know I've got a couple of appointments with people. If people want to come speak to me in my office, just feel free to come and knock on my door and talk about your assignments. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.